I want to begin with something so ordinary that most of us have walked past it without giving it a second thought. A tiny wild strawberry. Not the large strawberries you buy in a supermarket. I'm talking about the small forest strawberry that still grows along old stone walls, woodland paths, abandoned gardens, and the edges of forgotten parks. It's so common that it's easy to dismiss. And yet, for nearly 2,000 years, people across Europe didn't treat this plant as ordinary at all. They treated it as medicine. That surprised me, not because old medical books often contain unusual remedies. They do. What surprised me was how often this same berry kept appearing. A Greek physician mentioned it, then a Roman writer. Centuries later, medieval herbalists described it again, then another manuscript, and another. Different countries, different centuries, different authors. Yet they kept returning to the same small fruit. At first, I assumed it was simply a popular herbal remedy, the kind of thing every culture invents for itself. But then I found a manuscript written around 1580. Buried among dozens of ordinary remedies was a sentence that made me stop reading. It claimed that a preparation made from the wild strawberry could reverse what the author called the corruptions of age. That's a remarkable phrase, not because it proves the claim is true. It doesn't. Old medical texts are filled with ideas that modern medicine would reject. The interesting question isn't whether the manuscript was correct. It's why language like this kept appearing over and over again. If one anonymous writer had made the claim, it would be easy to ignore. But he wasn't alone. As I kept searching, I found similar descriptions repeated by physicians and herbalists separated by hundreds of years. Some praised the berry for restoring strength. Others connected it with vitality, healthy blood, or renewed energy. The wording changed. The pattern didn't. That made me wonder whether there was something more valuable here than the berry itself. Perhaps the real story was the knowledge surrounding it. Knowledge that survived generation after generation because people believed it was worth preserving. Then I came across something even stranger. The wild strawberry wasn't confined to old medical books. It had been carved into the stone of churches and cathedrals across Europe, not hidden away in the corner of a page, but permanently carved into buildings designed to outlive the people who built them. And that's where this investigation truly begins, because you don't preserve something in stone for centuries unless it meant far more than an ordinary forest plant. If the story had ended with old medical books, I probably wouldn't be making this video. History is full of forgotten remedies. Some worked, many didn't. But this investigation changed the moment I stopped reading medical texts and started looking at stone. Across Europe, from small village churches to some of the continent's great cathedrals, the wild strawberry appears carved into pillars, arches, altars, and doorways. At first glance, it's easy to miss. It's only a tiny fruit. Most visitors walk past it without ever noticing. But medieval stonemasons didn't carve random plants into buildings that were expected to stand for centuries. Every symbol had a reason. The oak represented strength, the vine represented life, the lily represented purity. So why the wild strawberry? According to medieval Christian symbolism, it represented righteousness, humility, and healing. Some writers even connected it with renewal and the restoration of the human body. Now, that doesn't prove the berry possessed extraordinary medicinal properties, but it does prove something else. People believed it was important enough to preserve in stone. Think about that for a moment. A berry that grows wild in forests wasn't only written about in books, it became part of Europe's permanent architecture. That alone makes it unusual. Then I went back to the medical literature. This time I wasn't looking for dramatic claims. I was looking for patterns, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't expected. The same berry kept appearing beside remarkably specific conditions. Greek physicians described it for inflammation. Roman writers mentioned disorders of the blood. Medieval herbalists recommended it for the kidneys, the liver, the mouth, and the throat. Nicholas Culpeper, writing in 17th century England, claimed preparations made from wild strawberries could restore vigor to aging blood. Different countries, different centuries, different authors. Yet they kept returning to the same plant. Of course, none of this proves they were correct. Medical knowledge has changed enormously over the last 2,000 years. But here's the question that kept bothering me. How did generations of physicians, monks, herbalists, and scholars, people separated by hundreds of years, continue treating this tiny forest berry as something far more valuable than an ordinary wild plant? Either they were all repeating the same tradition, or They were preserving observations that had survived for centuries. Then the investigation became even stranger, because when I stopped looking only at Europe, I found the same berry appearing in places where I never expected to see. By this point, I expected the trail to end. After all, perhaps the wild strawberry was simply one of those plants that happened to be respected in medieval Europe. History is full of traditions that never travelled very far, but that's not what I found. The deeper I looked, the wider the pattern became. In early records describing the medicinal traditions of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, French missionaries wrote about a small woodland strawberry used in preparations they believed helped restore strength to older members of the community. The missionaries dismissed many of these practices as local beliefs, but they carefully recorded what they saw. Then I looked east. In Japan, Edo period herbal texts describe a native field strawberry used in traditional remedies associated with vitality and longevity. Once again, the language wasn't identical to Europe, but the idea was surprisingly familiar. Then came South America. Spanish chroniclers describing indigenous traditions also mention native wild strawberries in healing practices. Like the missionaries, they often misunderstood or dismissed what they were recording, but the references remained. 3 different regions, 3 different cultures, thousands of miles apart, yet the same kind of small forest berry kept appearing in traditional medicine. Now, before we go any further, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying these cultures were connected. I'm not saying they all discovered the same medical truth. I'm simply pointing out a historical pattern that I found difficult to ignore. Different civilizations.
The more I looked into the 19th century, the stranger the story became. Up until that point, the wild strawberry had been treated as an ordinary part of everyday life. It grew without being planted. Children picked it. Families used it. Doctors wrote about it. Herbalists preserved recipes using its leaves, roots, and fruit. Then, sometime during the 1800s, the relationship began to change. I wasn't looking for evidence that anyone had banned the plant. I was looking for something much simpler. Why did it almost disappear from public spaces? That question led me into old park planning documents. London, Paris, Vienna, Berlin, New York. Different countries, different governments, different languages. Yet I kept finding remarkably similar instructions. Landscape architects wanted naturally spreading plants removed from newly designed public parks. The wording wasn't always identical, but the result was. Self-seeding plants were cleared away to create cleaner, more controlled landscapes. Among the species that repeatedly appeared in these records was the wild strawberry. Now, it's important to be fair here. There are perfectly ordinary reasons why city planners might remove naturally spreading plants. Parks were becoming carefully designed public spaces, not unmanaged forests. Appearance mattered, maintenance mattered, safety mattered.
Those are reasonable explanations, but one detail continued to bother me. If this was simply about making parks look tidy, why had a plant respected in medical writings for centuries become little more than a weed almost overnight? The historical record doesn't give us a clear answer. Instead, it gives us something more frustrating, a pattern. Around the same decades that traditional botanical medicine was gradually giving way to modern pharmaceutical medicine, references to the wild strawberry as an important medicinal plant became increasingly rare. Again, correlation is not proof. One event does not automatically explain the other. History is rarely that simple, but when 2 major changes happen during the same period, it's worth asking whether they're connected or whether they simply happened alongside one another. By the early 20th century, the transformation was almost complete. The wild strawberry hadn't vanished. It still grew in forests, hedgerows, old gardens, and forgotten corners of the countryside. What disappeared was something less visible: the knowledge. Generations who once recognized the plant for more than its fruit slowly stopped talking about it. Not because someone necessarily ordered them to forget. Sometimes knowledge disappears for a much quieter reason. Each generation passes on a little less than the one before it. And eventually, people stopped noticing what had been in front of them all along. That's what brought me to the final question. Was this simply the natural evolution of medicine? Or had centuries of observation quietly faded into history before anyone realized what was being lost? So, after following this story from ancient manuscripts to cathedral walls, from traditional medicine to 19th century park records, What are we left with? Surprisingly, not a simple answer. The wild strawberry still exists. You can still find it growing in forests, along old paths, beside stone walls, and in places that have changed very little over the last few centuries. The plant survived. What changed was the way people looked at it. For thousands of years, physicians, herbalists, and ordinary families believed this tiny berry deserved a place in their medicine, their traditions, and even their architecture. Whether every one of those beliefs was scientifically correct isn't really the point. The remarkable fact is that so many generations considered it important enough to preserve. Then, over the course of just a few generations, much of that knowledge quietly faded away. Not because every old idea was disproved, not because every old book disappeared, but because the world changed. Modern medicine advanced, cities expanded, public parks became carefully managed landscapes. Traditional remedies were gradually replaced by laboratories, pharmacies, and standardized treatments. That's the story history usually tells, but I keep coming back to one simple question: how much knowledge disappears? Not because it was false, but because no one continues asking whether it was worth remembering. Perhaps the wild strawberry was simply another herbal remedy whose reputation grew larger than its true effects. That's entirely possible. Or perhaps earlier generations observed something that modern science has only partly explored. That possibility also deserves careful investigation. At the moment, the evidence doesn't allow us to reach a final conclusion, and that's perfectly acceptable. History isn't always about solving every mystery. Sometimes it's about recognizing the questions that remain. The next time you walk through an old woodland, along a forgotten path, or past a crumbling stone wall, you might see a tiny wild strawberry growing unnoticed beneath your feet. Most people will walk right past it, just as they have for generations. But now you'll know that this small plant once occupied a very different place in human history, not as a weed, not merely as a fruit, but as something countless people believed was worth writing about, carving into stone, and passing from one generation to the next, whether they were right or wrong. That forgotten story may be just as fascinating as the plant itself, and perhaps the greatest lesson isn't about the wild strawberry at all. It's about how easily knowledge can fade when people stop paying attention. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.